Hello and welcome to Rotten Reviews, and today it's another patron request where I hand the keys to the channel over to some of my most trusted subscribers and let them pick out what I'm going to be watching and reviewing today. And today's movie comes to us from patron Jackie, who wanted me to take a look at the 1958 movie How to Make a Monster. And Jackie's reasoning for this is actually kind of interesting. She says, strangely, I feel that there is a lot of interesting things to say about this film, and I spent the last year since watching it trying to verbalize what it is I feel and failing. Maybe you'll have better luck. Well, challenge accepted. I don't know if I'm going to live up to it, but I'm certainly going to try, and here we go. Directed by Herbert L. Strock, a famous but not hugely famous B-movie director, not along the lines of William Castle or Ed Wood, but nevertheless was renowned, especially for his most notable piece, I Was a Teenage Werewolf, starring Michael Landon. And this movie centers around the fictitious character of Pete Dumond, who is playing a Hollywood makeup artist specializing in monster makeup. Nobody can do it as well as he can, but that doesn't matter a lick when the studio gets bought out by new executives and they're just done with monster movies. They want to move on to the next thing. So they basically give him his pink slip and kick him to the curb. And in his last few weeks before everything settles down and he packs up his stuff and leaves, he goes on some murderous sprees. But he doesn't just grab a hatchet and start going to town. It's much more complex and sinister than that, as he incorporates a suggestible element into some makeup compounds and causes people to fall under hypnosis when they're made up with this foundational element, and then has them do it for him while dressed up in monster movie makeup. So when this movie was made, 1950, we're talking like peak gimmick time. We're talking, like I mentioned, William Castle, the vibration under the seats, or having the ghost spin around, or any number of the things that he did, the life insurance policies if anybody were to die of shock and fright during the airing of his movies, things like that. And Herbert L. Strock was not immune to this. He definitely had his own little flair that added things to this. Most notably, he advertised this movie as being in color, but not just in color, but see the ghastly ghouls in flaming color. The thing of it is, the color didn't even enter into this movie until the last 15-20 minutes of it or so. All of a sudden, it just goes from this black and white picture to color. And honestly, I just love the gimmicky period of horror and monster movies that were around back then. And, just how elaborate and also how cheap they could be. I also think that this movie kind of deserves a little bit of, I don't know about accolades, but some recognition, because I've been racking my brain and I cannot think of a earlier film than this one that was what I would categorize as meta horror. And I think that this certainly falls under that category. We're talking about a makeup artist in the film that has made up movies for I Was a Teenage Werewolf and I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, both movies that Herbert Strock actually directed. In fact, they actually got the monster actor of Gary Conway from I Was a Teenage Frankenstein to reprise his role in this film. So the fact that we actually have this kind of behind-the-scenes monster makeup kind of thing happening on a Hollywood backlot, I thought it was just a lot of fun in its own right with just that. Unfortunately, the rest of the movie really does kind of fall apart when you bring any kind of logic into it. First of all, we are talking about an era of cinema in which the gruesomeness really is toned down. It's certainly a couple years, possibly even a decade before things really started going absolutely bonkers in horror films. This is really kind of dead middle of the Hays Code era, so we're not talking about massive amounts of gore, blood, guts, anything like that. Instead, it's more toned down, and we are talking about movies where the big ultimate horror stakes of this is just the macabre and the murder, as opposed to violent, gruesome eviscerations or actual all the way to the nines monster mayhem. As far as what I really had an issue with about this movie, it's more just the core of the plot elements. We have this character of Pete Dumont who is playing a cat and mouse game with the detectives. Once the first murder happens, then the police are on the scene asking questions about everybody and so forth, but there's more murders to happen. And, is Pete going to get found out? If so, how? Things like that. But as far as that goes, I don't know. It just kind of rings a little hollow to me that somebody would be planning these murders to be happening and leave his signature calling card as the only person in town that could possibly do this. There's constantly frequent discussions that are happening about how Pete is the best in the monster movie makeup department. Nobody in Hollywood could possibly do it as well as he can. These are his creations, and nobody else could do this. Which makes perfect sense to send out the killers wearing the exact thing that nobody else in the world can do. I mean, if we have killers that he's sending out into the world that are being hypnotically affected by this foundational makeup, why not just give them a little rub down, throw a potato sack over their face, and send them out? Instead, it has to be the most elaborate monster makeup that only Pete Dumont can do. I have a really big soft spot for movies of this era, and movies of this ilk even. I know that classic horror films are not on everybody's radar right now, and a lot of people are turning away from them, and I honestly think that that's a bit of a shame. I don't want to ram it down anybody's throat that you're not a real horror fan unless you watch these. I think that that kind of gatekeeping is extraordinarily counterproductive, and I'll be the last person to do that. But I do think that there is some merit in the foundational knowledge of the history of horror and how we got to where we are today. And movies like this are one of the most key elements of it. Movies of this era where they did have to operate within the Hays Code, movies like Herbert Strock put out, are important, and they're just a lot of fun to boot. Now, just for me, on a personal level, talking about movies of this era, I would have to say that movies such as this are probably on my kind of least favorite subgenre elements. I really did enjoy the House on Haunted Hill, the monsters and the hauntings and the ghosts and so forth. The idea of actually taking that and putting it into the real world and only having the stakes or the horror elements be just one person murdering another, I appreciate it. It's just not my favorite thing in the world. But again, just kind of rattling around in my brain, I really can't think of any earlier meta horror movie. So on that basis alone, I think that this really is some solid foundational material to work with. If anybody else can think of an earlier movie that would be classified as meta horror earlier than 1958, please leave comments below. I would love to hear about it. I would love to watch it. I'd especially love to know if I'm just blanking on it and it was an obvious thing and it's like, oh, you forgot about brr. That happens. But look, if we're talking about classic horror films, then we're definitely going to be talking about werewolf movies, Wolfman movies, so on and so forth. And in that, it's inescapable that the notion of Michael Landon's I Was a Teenage Werewolf would ever be left off the table. And if you're going to watch that, then I think that this would be a great little leap to the next stage, is to kind of watch the continuation of the series in its own way. I Was a Teenage Werewolf, I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, and How to Make a Monster. So even though this movie wasn't my favorite in the world, even of the era that it came out in, and it did suffer from some pretty serious logical plot holes, I do think that it is worth watching. It's a great foundational film, and I can't help but recommend the 1958 movie How to Make a Monster. Thank you to Jackie for recommending this one to me. I am very glad that I watched it, and I hope that this review has perhaps shed some light on some of the verbiage that you've been struggling with yourself. We'll see. But thank you for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please click like and subscribe. And remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.